Welcome everyone to this Turnkey Consulting webinar. The focus today is governance-based identity management. We cover the benefits of an identity governance model and how to prepare for improving your management of identities. Today, we welcome a guest, SailPoint expert, Mark Oldroyd. Mark is responsible for all technical pre-sales education and solution training for SailPoint's partners. Mark has worked with SailPoint for 6 years and has been in the governance, security and identity management space for 15 years. So during the webinar, if you have questions, please use the chat or the questions feature and I will field them towards the end of the session and ask your questions to Mark. Enjoy the presentation. Okay, Mark, I'll hand over control to you now.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the screen that I'm presenting. So let's start to think about some of the identity challenges that typical organizations see today. When we start to look at the type of users that we support as an organization, this is increasingly more complex. Not only do we have the traditional kind of employees and contractors that are working on site, we've now got a lot of different business relationships. We have external suppliers, we have customers in many cases, we have people using different devices, different channels to access our applications. So this is a complex set of users that we typically have to manage in any organization. When we look at the systems that we're managing, and again, typically this is increasing in complexity on a daily basis, we have our traditional on-premise applications, we have our email services and our file share environments. We also have the impact of cloud and transformational programs. So again, the applications that we're managing as an organization is constantly changing and increasing the complexity. And what we find typically are processes that have been developed over a long period of time that are there to support the provisioning of those applications and those access requirements. So we have a myriad of processes in place to control all of this. The problem we have is the interconnectivity, the complexity and the visibility, as we'll see later. So given we understand the complexity of the environment, how do these challenges manifest themselves? What kind of issues do we typically see in organizations that indicate poor identity management? Well, there are a number of different categories. Most of you will have seen some or all of these situations, I'm sure, but effectively, there are a whole series of things that we need to have a look at. Orphan accounts, for example, accounts where there is application access available, there's an account with a valid password, it is enabled. The problem is, do we actually know who is using that account? In many cases, we're going to have people leaving the organization, their accounts are not being disabled or deleted, so they become what we call orphan accounts. Sitting there, they're available for use, potentially they've shared their password with a coworker. We don't actually know the risk associated with those kinds of accounts. We also see entitlement creep, which again is typically a result of poor mover processes. When people change job function, move around the organization, typically they acquire additional or accumulated access rights. There's very little process involved in going back and analyzing the access they have, making sure it's relevant, removing old access from previous job functions. So we get this creep or this accumulation of access rights based on the lifetime of a user. We also have things like rogue accounts. Potentially if you have staff who are capable of going in, creating accounts in systems, those accounts could then be used for fraudulent activities, or even external attackers coming in and creating rogue accounts. Again, we need to understand, do these exist, and if so, what access do they have in order to control them effectively? And then finally, we've got overprivileged users. These are the people with, as we say, the keys to the kingdom. They have very deep, very highly privileged access. Again, those are the people that potentially introduce the risk into the organization. If those accounts are compromised, there is significant increased risk from from those accounts. So again, a lot of this is about visibility, understanding all of these different issues in here and being able to identify and manage them. And this situation is only getting worse. What most organizations are facing now are small or large scale digital transformation, moving our activities to the cloud, moving our infrastructure to the cloud and our applications and services. Again, this increases the complexity. We've now got applications outside the perimeter. It's just as important that we understand who has access to those applications, make sure we clean up the access when people leave, when people change job functions, and basically control those things. So this is having a significant impact, again, on the complexity of the management of user identities. And finally, just to add more complexity, we now have legislations, or most of us are subject to legislation that again is putting additional stress on our identity management infrastructures. Things like GDPR all of a sudden come along and they talk about unstructured data, managing user access, discovering the access that users have to sensitive information, being able to recognize that, being able to recognize potential breaches and exposure of information. Again, all of this is really stressing the systems and the processes that we've typically built up over the past few years to manage our user identities. So we now start to think about this situation as a cyber security issue. There's some examples on screen here. $158 is the average cost per lost or stolen record. This came out of a study back in 2016 by the Ponemon Institute, and there have been many studies since that time talking about the cost of exposed data. So that's what we're trying to protect. We're trying to understand our identity infrastructure, protect our information at the same time. What are the things that we need to do to really start to control this environment and really govern the access of our users and at the same time protect our information? Well, there are a number of questions that we need to start thinking about. The initial questions that we really need to understand is kind of a twofold question. First of all, where does the data exist in our organization? And we're talking about the sensitive information, the real critical information here. It could be customer information, it could be financial activities, it could be operational details of the company. Each organization will have its own categories of sensitive data, but we need to understand where that information is in order to be able to protect it. Secondly, we need to understand who has got access. And this is quite a wide-ranging question. Who are the users in our organization? Who are the employees, contractors, any external users who have access to our systems, business partners, vendor relationships? We need to understand all of those. For each one of those users, we need to understand which of our applications and services they can access. Where do they hold accounts in our systems? And further, in terms of those accounts, what business functions can those accounts execute? What rights, privileges, group memberships, entitlements do those accounts hold? This is the fundamental piece that we can address with identity governance solutions, getting that visibility. And as we'll see later, that can be quite a complex view to construct. If we ask a typical organization, do they already have this view of user access? You will probably get two different answers. From the IT departments, they will answer positively. They have a view of all the user accounts and the access that those accounts have. The problem is that is a technical view. If we then go to the business people, the operational team leaders, application owners, ask them if they have a view of who has access in the applications, the answer is typically no. There is no business level view of that. And that's something we can address very quickly with identity governance solutions. Once we have that visibility, we can then start to apply checks and controls to make sure the access we've identified is appropriate for each of those users. And we'll talk about this in the next few slides in a bit more detail. And then finally, once we've got this environment under control, we are checking for appropriate access. we can start to use this environment as supporting information for our IT audit processes or our general legislative audit processes. We now have a forensic record of all the users, the access they have, how they received it, who approved it, when was it provisioned, etc., etc. That takes us a long way down this governance approach, and we'll talk a little bit more about the methodology that you can use to get to this level of maturity. So let's just step back a little bit and go back to some of those challenges that we talked about earlier. Typically what we see in an organization, as we've seen, is a complex set of users over here on the left, and on the right we have a complex, ever-changing set of applications and services that we have to provide to those users. Now, in most organizations, we have these processes that have evolved over a period of time. They could be manual processes, they could be automated using various technologies, maybe some identity management solutions in there. They could be help desk driven processes, but effectively all organizations have these processes. Some kind of trigger occurs in the user population, a joiner, a movement, a leaver, potentially. That event is passed through various mechanisms into these provisioning processes which are managed by the IT department. Those processes will then create accounts, change entitlements, remove accounts as required by the triggers. The problem we have is that typically in an organization there are many of these processes, and as I've said, this is a mix of automated and manual processes, ticketing systems, workflow solutions, and most organizations have a variety of things out there. The problem we have with this is one, again, of visibility. Consider a mover situation. Someone changes job function, moves from the accounting team to the sales team. If we do get that trigger, and in many cases we don't even see that trigger, if we get that trigger to say this person has moved to the sales team, what typically happens? That typically flows into the IT department. The IT department provision the additional access for that user to give him access or her access to the sales systems, and the ticket is closed, or the job is closed. That's the result of the process. There could be multiple processes happening based on that trigger, and the problem we have is that there's no controlling mechanism. There's nothing looking at the outcome of all of these processes to say, was that a safe thing to do? We've provisioned access for the new guy into the sales systems. We did not remove his accounting access. So potentially there we've got a toxic combination of access rights that we've created without really checking. What we really want to do is think more along the lines of governance and compliance and start to build processes that are aware of these situations. And what we've got on screen here is a typical access request, self-service access request. Governance solutions like SailPoint don't particularly focus on the provisioning element, it's about the business interface. So what we provide are business interface tools that allow users to come in to the system, look at their access or look at the access of their direct reports potentially, and request additional access or changes. In this case, we're requesting something like a business role. What the users are doing here is searching and requesting functions. They're not searching for technical components, entitlements, group memberships. They're looking for business functionality. I need to be able to create a supplier in the finance system. That's what they request. The governance system then takes that request, breaks it down into the technical components, assesses the risk, applies all the various policies, goes out and executes dynamic workflow approval models potentially, but ultimately uses a number of different mechanisms to determine, is this change appropriate for this user? If it is appropriate, we then fire off the provisioning request into the provisioning systems. Now, again, these processes could be the existing manual or automated processes if you have existing investments. They could also be executed by, for example, by SailPoint, by the governance solutions. But ultimately, the focus here is on the business interface, not necessarily on the efficiency and automation of the provisioning process. So what we've described here is quite a mature way of approaching identity governance. How do we get ourselves to that point? How do we get to that maturity? Well, SailPoint have developed a 4-stage process that really describes the approach, how we get control of our environment and how we start to benefit from some of the automation and control mechanisms we've talked about. Initially, we choose to deploy the solution. And as we'll see certainly from SailPoint, there are multiple ways that you can do this. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But once we have the solution in the environment, the first thing we need to do is collect as much information as we can about the users. And typically we're connecting into authoritative sources here. It could be HR systems, it could be financial payment systems, it could be other systems of record. But we're pulling in identity information, and for each identity we find, we create a record in our identity warehouse. Okay, that record, in SailPoint terms, we call that an identity cube. That is populated with as much information as we want to store. So typically job function, departments, unique identifiers, anything else that we think is relevant. Once we have that information and it's constantly being refreshed from those authoritative sources, we then turn our attentions to the applications, the services, the file systems in our environment. We start connecting into those infrastructures and we pull in the access from those environments, and typically that consists of accounts, and for each account we have a set of entitlements or group memberships. All that information starts coming into the SailPoint system, and what we have to do here is correlate that back to the identity records we already have. So we're constantly trying to link the accounts in those systems back to the users we know about. That can be a simple or a complex process, but ultimately it will throw out a number of the issues that we've seen earlier on. So for example, orphan accounts. We will identify the accounts here where there is no obvious business owner, and we then have processes to deal with those accounts. But ultimately, we're building this view of, or this visibility of access across our applications and services. Once we have that visibility, we then have the capability to perform analytics and searches and reporting and look at the information we've found. But really what we need now is the help of the business. We need the operational people to validate the data that we found. And this is typically done using something called access certification or access review. Take the information we've collected, translate it into business language, and present it back to the business people for their verification. Okay, and this is where we're going to identify all those challenges and problems we've seen earlier, overprivileged users, entitlement creep. During these certification processes, we should be starting to reduce the impact of those things and ultimately deprovisioning or removing unnecessary access. So once we've been through that validation process, we then have the ability to start defining more control mechanisms. Policies are typically where people start to do this. It's what we call separation of duty or segregation of duty policies, toxic combinations of access, either inside a specific application or across multiple applications. Those are the things that we're particularly interested in. We can define those in the system as policies and start to perform detective checking against the information we hold in the warehouse. Each violation will create a work item, a violation work item that is sent out to the business people again. This is not an IT problem to fix, this is a business situation that we found. So we get the help of the business people to determine, is this toxic combination acceptable? Is it something that is known, maybe for a short period of time, or does it need to be dealt with by the removal of specific access? Policies are just one mechanism. We also have a lot of capabilities around role management, role mining, being able to identify the common access for particular business functions or departmental workers or geographic based workers, and package up that access into what we call a business or technical role. Again, that has the impact of making life simpler further down the line when we're doing access reviews and various other things. So we can define a whole series of these checks and balances. Finally, then we can start to address some of the automation, creating lifecycle processes, recognizing a new starter in the organization from our connection with the authoritative sources. What do we do when that new starter arrives? We can allocate appropriate business roles to them to give them the base access that they require. We can trigger certifications. We know who their manager is. We can trigger all kinds of workflows. Similarly for movers and leavers. In addition, we might think about offering up self-service. As we talked about on the previous slides, the ability to request access, have that go through the checks and approval processes, and then be automatically provisioned. All of that can be done as part of this methodology. And this methodology, this four-stage approach, shows business benefit all the way through this process. This can be repeated. Once we've onboarded a whole set of applications, we can just keep repeating the process, onboarding more and more of our systems and services until we cover the entire enterprise. At the beginning of that previous slide, I talked about the implementation of the solution, the governance solution itself. One of the things that you need to consider when thinking about identity governance is how you, as an organization, how you prefer to consume these kind of services, these IT services. You may be a traditional on-premise organization, prefer to have your applications and your infrastructure on-premise. If so, the identity governance solution that you choose should be able to fully support that kind of on-premise deployment. And typically that comes along with the capability for extensive customization and configuration to really make that implementation work according to your processes and your restrictions. At the other end of the scale, we may have organizations that prefer to invest in new technologies through a SaaS model. So again, you may need to look at an organization that can provide that kind of capability. You want the same functionality that we've talked about, the same controls and capabilities, but we want to consume that from the cloud as a cloud-based service. And there are different flavors in between that. You may want a customized solution, but delivered effectively as a cloud service to you or a managed service. So when considering these kind of technologies, you need to think about this consumption model, not only for today, but where you may be in the future. Another consideration, again, covering you for the future, is potentially the connectivity of these systems, these governance solutions. So when you're considering an identity governance approach, you need to think about potentially, what you need to be able to manage. What applications and services are you running internally today? What cloud solutions do you have? What security systems do you have? So you need to start thinking about a solution that has that flexibility and connectivity capability to support your needs going forward. And again, with solutions like SailPoint, what we find is a very rich connector fabric within the products. A lot of built-in capabilities, 80 plus connectors in the base product that support typically on-premise applications, cloud applications, directory services, databases, and all the typical application environments that we see. In addition to those provisioning connectors, we have the type of connectivity you see here in terms of your security infrastructure. So I did mention a few times in this presentation talking about file shares as well as applications. You can see quite clearly on the right at the bottom here we have unstructured data management connectivity. Things like Windows file shares, SharePoint environments, cloud-based collaboration solutions. Again, when you're starting to consider identity governance solutions, you need to consider the entire environment. Traditionally, identity management has focused very strongly on the application and infrastructure areas. Being able to manage accounts in directories and applications is very mature now, and it's something obviously we need to consider. But when we're talking about governance, we need to think about the entire environment. That is both applications and your unstructured file storage areas. As we've seen from things like GDPR, all of this is in scope for GDPR. And because of the amount of sensitive information that is sitting in your file storage systems and your collaborative environments in the form of Word documents or PDFs, again, we need to consider all of this. This has to be a comprehensive governance approach covering all your storage systems. So hopefully you recognize some of the challenges in there, and that we've talked through some of the approaches and some of the considerations you need to have when selecting this kind of solution to manage and govern your identities. Just a few words on SailPoint. As you can see from the various analyst reports on the right hand side of the screen there, we're very successful in doing this. We've been well positioned with these analysts for a number of years now. At the top we have Gartner. The next chart down is the Forrester Wave that came out very recently, and then two reports at the bottom from KuppingerCole in Germany, addressing slightly different topics, but effectively all in the governance area. And as you can see, we're very well placed. This is effectively all that SailPoint do. We are purely focused on identity and access management, identity governance solutions across both your applications and your unstructured data. We have a lot of customers in a whole variety of industry sectors, lots of case studies and people that you can speak to see how successful SailPoint solutions have been. One of the things we typically draw attention to is our high level of customer satisfaction. We have a very low churn rate, we have a lot of happy customers, and as a result we've got a lot of people that are willing to talk about their experiences and their benefits from SailPoint solutions. So I just want to finish off with a very final slide. Why SailPoint for identity governance? We've talked about the challenges, you've seen the approaches that we've developed as SailPoint, you've seen some of the technology very briefly that we apply to this space. This is really a business problem that we're talking about. It's about visibility of user access, and hopefully from what you've seen, that is a big element of the SailPoint identity governance story. Getting access to all of that information, presenting that in a business format to the business people to allow them to make decisions and empower them to help protect our information, reduce the risk in our organization. Also, when we're looking at the technology and the type of solutions that should be deployed, from a SailPoint perspective, these are single solutions. We're not talking about stacks of technology and lots of interconnected components that have to be maintained and managed. Even with the on-premise solution, it's a very, very specific application, single application. If we choose to consume from the cloud, then again, it's a very simplistic approach to get access to that cloud environment. So hopefully you've seen a lot of the benefits and the values that SailPoint can bring around your identity management infrastructure. Thank you for attending this webinar. If you would like further information, please contact Turnkey Consulting and we can organize a follow-up discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
And if anyone does want to get in touch with any follow-up from this webinar, then please use the email address provided. I'll just take my screen again. I think I've got a one slide to finish off there, Mark. There we are. So just so you know that the things that are coming up, an SAP GRC 12 webinar next March, and then on-demand webinars. You can see webinars that have already happened, and that's on our website. And then we're going to have a special guest webinar on GDPR. Above, that's the row at the bottom, and the icons above, you can see some information that you can access. So I think that's it for today. Thanks very much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at the next of these sessions.